The morning sun poured through the wide glass windows of Denver International Airport, casting long golden beams across the polished floor as Olivia Bennett made her way through Concourse A. At 34, Olivia carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had seen the world but never let it change her core. A soft-spoken woman with warm brown skin and intelligent eyes, she wore a dark gray sweatshirt, matching sweatpants, and sneakers that had clearly walked more miles than most luxury shoes ever would. Her only accessory was a silver bracelet, worn, delicate, and full of sentimental value. To most passers-by, Olivia might have seemed like any other traveler, perhaps even a little underdressed for first class. But that was never something she concerned herself with. Her hair was tucked beneath a black baseball cap, and she carried a faded navy backpack slung over one shoulder, rather than any designer luggage. She didn't fly to be seen. She flew to get where she needed to go. Today, that destination was Boston, where her parents were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. Olivia wouldn't miss it for the world. Her husband, Alexander Bennett, yes, that Alexander Bennett, the tech magnate and billionaire entrepreneur, had offered to send the private jet. But she politely declined. Flying commercial kept her grounded in ways that private air travel never could. She liked seeing everyday people, hearing snatches of conversation from strangers, watching families reunite. And honestly, she liked the sense of normalcy. Not everything in her life had to come with champagne and silk seats. She stopped at a small airport cafe and ordered a regular black coffee. No oat milk. No syrup. No fancy customization. Just coffee, please, she said with a warm smile, handing over a few bills and dropping the change into the tip jar. The barista, a young man with a kind face, asked if she was headed somewhere special. Boston. Family celebration, she answered. Well, have a great flight, he said, genuinely. With coffee in hand, Olivia strolled toward gate A22. She took her time, sipping slowly, watching the world go by. She noticed the elderly couple holding hands near the window, the teenager nervously checking his phone for updates, and the soldier in uniform quietly standing alone. These were the moments she cherished, ordinary people, each on their own unique journey. As the gate agent announced first-class boarding for Summit Airlines Flight 782, Olivia rose from her seat and walked calmly to the priority lane. She pulled out her digital boarding pass, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't expect what would happen next. But in her heart, she was prepared for anything. After all, she'd learned long ago that some people still judged others by appearances. But Olivia Bennett, daughter of school teachers, wife of a billionaire, and a woman of quiet dignity, knew that true worth didn't need to be worn on your sleeve. As Olivia stepped onto the jet bridge leading to the aircraft, she felt the familiar hum of engines and the chill of the air conditioning settle around her. It wasn't her first time flying first class, not by a long shot, but today felt different. Maybe it was the casual clothes. Maybe it was the look she caught from the man in the tailored suit who gave her a once-over as she walked ahead of him. The first-class cabin of Summit Airlines Flight 782 was a picture of quiet luxury. Polished wood paneling, wide leather seats with navy trim, and soft lighting set the tone. Flight attendants moved gracefully between passengers, offering flutes of chilled champagne and distributing plush blankets. Everything gleamed with that curated sense of exclusivity. Olivia smiled politely and stepped into the aisle. "Good morning," she said to the flight attendant standing near the front. The woman, Diane, according to her gold name tag, blinked as if startled. Her eyes swept quickly over Olivia's sweatshirt and backpack. "First class is to your left," she said, her tone polite but slightly puzzled. "Yes, I know. I'm in 2O," Olivia replied with quiet confidence, pointing toward the window seat near the front of the cabin. Diane didn't argue, but her brows lifted subtly, betraying surprise. Olivia knew that look. She'd seen it in upscale restaurants, boutiques, even at a charity gala once, whenever people couldn't reconcile her appearance with the spaces she occupied. She placed her backpack in the overhead bin, took her seat, and pulled out a paperback novel she'd read twice already. She found comfort in its worn pages. But just as she opened to the first chapter, a male flight attendant, Richard, approached her row. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and formal. "May I see your boarding pass?" Olivia looked up calmly. "Of course," she said, holding out her phone. He examined it longer than necessary, his eyes flicking between the screen and her face. "Just a moment, please," he said, turning to speak in hushed tones with Diane. Olivia sighed inwardly. She could feel it unfolding. The judgment, the subtle interrogation, the unspoken message, "You don't look like you belong here." Within minutes, a third crew member approached, Caroline, whose crisp uniform and clipboard suggested she was in charge. "There seems to be some confusion about your seat," Caroline began, her tone controlled, but cool. "There's no confusion," Olivia replied steadily. "My boarding pass says 2A. That's this seat." Caroline forced a tight smile. "Sometimes the system makes mistakes." "Or sometimes people do," Olivia said, meeting her gaze. The tension thickened. Olivia wasn't angry, not yet, but she could feel the eyes of other passengers turning toward her. Some looked curious, others indifferent. But she felt the weight of being the only one questioned, the only one challenged. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She was calm, composed, and fully within her rights. And yet, as the pressure to verify her place built around her, Olivia realized this wasn't just about a boarding pass, it was about perception. And soon, it would be about something much bigger. The mood in the cabin shifted as Caroline's insistence grew sharper. Olivia remained seated in 2A, her hands calm in her lap, her voice steady, but the patience behind her warm brown eyes was wearing thin. She'd already had her boarding pass checked 3 times. No one else around her had been subjected to that kind of scrutiny. She wasn't trying to draw attention, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers, the side glances, the lingering eyes trying to piece together why she was out of place. "Ma'am," Caroline said, this time with an edge in her voice, "if you're unable to verify your identity, we'll have to reassign you to a seat in the main cabin." "You've already verified my identity," Olivia replied. "The gate agent scanned my boarding pass. My name is Olivia Bennett. That's what the reservation says." Richard, arms folded just behind Caroline, added with a hint of smugness, "Our system shows this seat belongs to an O. Bennett." "That's me," Olivia responded evenly. "Olivia Bennett." A heavy pause followed. The moment hovered between disbelief and condescension. "Do you have any form of ID?" Richard asked, his tone now tipping into accusatory. "Just to clear up the confusion." Olivia's lips parted in disbelief. She scanned the faces around her. No one else had been asked to show ID once they boarded. The man across the aisle with a Wall Street Journal in his lap wore sweatpants and a ball cap, but no one questioned him. An older white woman in a floral cardigan sat sipping champagne 2 rows ahead, her tiny dog nestled beside her. Not one eyebrow had been raised in their direction. Her voice dropped to a firmer, more resolute tone. "You're not asking for verification. You're asking for justification. Because I don't look the way you expect someone in this seat to look." Richard and Caroline exchanged glances, now aware that they were being watched, by other first-class passengers who were no longer pretending to mind their own business. A man near the front cleared his throat. "She said she belongs in that seat," he said, not loudly, but with unmistakable authority. "Why are we still having this conversation?" Caroline flushed but stood her ground. "We have protocols to follow." "No," Olivia said. "You have biases you're following." Caroline drew in a sharp breath. "If you refuse to show ID, we'll need to move you to economy or remove you from the aircraft." The words struck like a slap. Olivia exhaled slowly, realizing the position she'd been cornered into. She could end this with one sentence. She could say, "My husband owns this airline." That would shut everything down in a heartbeat. But she didn't. That wasn't how she lived her life. She didn't walk around with her husband's wealth as a shield or weapon. Her dignity wasn't for sale, and her identity didn't need validation through someone else's success. She stood up and said, "I'll move. But this isn't over." And it wouldn't be. The next morning, sunlight poured over downtown Denver, catching the steel and glass curves of Summit Airlines' corporate headquarters. Inside the sleek boardroom on the 17th floor, tension was building. Patricia Winters, the airline's chief customer officer, reviewed the morning's agenda while trying to ignore the pit in her stomach. The quarterly customer experience review was scheduled for 10 a.m., and the numbers weren't encouraging. Complaints were up 11% over the last quarter. Most revolved around passenger treatment, especially in premium cabins. "It's the tone," one customer had written. "Like they were doing me a favor letting me sit where I paid to be." That line had stuck with Patricia. And now, to complicate matters, the company's billionaire owner, Alexander Bennett, had confirmed that he'd be attending the meeting in person. Alexander didn't make unnecessary appearances. He didn't have time for pleasantries. If he was coming to the review himself, something was wrong. "Make sure the first-class team from Flight 782 is here," Patricia told her assistant. That's Caroline Reynolds and her crew. Their satisfaction numbers are among the highest. We'll need a few bright spots to share with the board. Across town, in the Bennett's spacious penthouse overlooking the Rockies, Alexander adjusted his tie in the mirror. At 38, he was one of the most influential tech innovators in the country. Today, though, he wasn't thinking about algorithms or product launches. He was thinking about his wife. Behind him, Olivia sat quietly on the edge of the bed, watching his reflection. She was calm, but her silence spoke volumes. He had seen the hurt in her eyes the night before, even though she had tried not to show it. "Are you sure you don't want me to say something directly to the crew?" he asked, turning toward her. "They humiliated you, Liv. That's not something I can let slide." Olivia gave a faint smile and stood to straighten his tie, though it was already perfect. "You saying something wouldn't be wrong," she said, "but this isn't just about me. This is about a bigger problem. A culture that lets people make judgments in seconds and call it procedure." Alexander studied her face, always struck by her grace under pressure. She had grown up in a small town, raised by teachers who believed in kindness, fairness, and speaking up when it mattered. It was part of what drew him to her from the start. "I trust you," he said. "But you'll be heard. Today." She nodded. "Oh, I'll be heard. And I'll be wearing the same outfit as yesterday." At 10 a.m. sharp, the conference room began to fill. Executives settled in. The board took their seats. And in the back row, Caroline, Richard, and Diane whispered confidently to one another, unaware that their day, and their understanding of customer service, was about to change forever. The Summit Airlines executive conference room buzzed with anticipation. Caroline Reynolds, senior flight attendant of the first-class crew, sat beside Richard and Diane near the back, feeling quietly confident. Their team had consistently received high customer satisfaction scores, and they assumed that was the reason they had been invited to this high-level quarterly review. "I think they're finally rolling out that elite service initiative," Richard whispered. "We're the natural fit to lead it." Diane smoothed her uniform and smiled. "I heard Mr. Bennett's attending in person. This could be huge for us." Up front, Chief Customer Officer Patricia Winters welcomed the group and launched into a well-rehearsed presentation. She pointed to colorful graphs showing trends in customer feedback. She highlighted strengths, on-time departures, gourmet meal upgrades, and luxury lounge improvements. But she quickly transitioned into rising concerns, increases in complaints, especially surrounding passenger treatment. "We pride ourselves on premium service," Patricia said. "But the experience must be consistently excellent, no matter who is in the seat." Just as she turned to spotlight high-performing teams, the door at the back of the room opened quietly. All eyes turned as Alexander Bennett entered, dressed in a navy suit, exuding calm authority. He nodded once to acknowledge the room and took his seat at the head of the table. "And now," Patricia continued with a smile, "I'd like to recognize our top-performing first-class crew. Caroline Reynolds will share how her team maintains such high service standards." Caroline stood confidently, walking to the front of the room. "At Summit Airlines," she began, "we believe first class isn't just about the seat. It's about anticipating needs, offering a personal touch, and ensuring that every guest feels valued." Her words were smooth, polished. But before she could finish her second sentence, Alexander raised his hand gently. "Pardon the interruption," he said, standing. "I believe someone here has first-hand experience with that philosophy." The room went still. From the back stepped a woman in a gray sweatshirt, matching sweatpants, and a black cap. Caroline's face drained of color. Richard and Diane sat frozen, expressions shifting from confusion to dawning horror. "This," Alexander said, "is my wife, Olivia Bennett. She flew on Summit Airlines Flight 782 yesterday. In Seat 2A. A stunned silence fell over the room. Caroline's notes trembled in her hand. "She was asked to prove her identity multiple times," Alexander continued. "Questioned. Doubted. Removed from her paid seat because she didn't look like a first-class passenger." Olivia stepped forward, composed and clear. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she said. "It was bias. And unfortunately, it wasn't the first time something like this has happened." She placed a folder on the table. 27 cases in 3 months. All involving passengers who didn't fit the expected mold. The boardroom had shifted. What began as a performance review had turned into a reckoning, a call to face the gap between brand promise and lived experience. And for the first time that morning, Caroline, Richard, and Diane had nothing to say. The air in the conference room hung heavy after Olivia's words. No one dared to speak first. Executives, board members, and department heads sat in stiff silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Patricia Winters slowly reached for the folder Olivia had placed on the table. Inside were documented reports, each one detailing an incident similar in tone. A passenger assumed to be in the wrong place, questioned for how they looked, not for anything they had done. Across the room, Alexander Bennett stood with calm authority. His voice was even, but every word carried weight. "This isn't just about one flight," he said. "It's about a culture. One that allows people to be judged by appearance before they're ever greeted with dignity." Caroline tried to speak. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, I want to sincerely apologize. On behalf of our team, we were following procedure." Olivia gently raised a hand, stopping her. "It's not about procedure. It's about how you chose to apply it. Did you ask the older gentleman in 2C, who wore sweatpants, for his ID? Or the woman in 1A wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap? No, you didn't. You asked me, because I didn't fit the image you expected." The tension in the room deepened. Richard shifted in his seat. Diane stared at the table. It was clear now, this wasn't just a professional embarrassment. It was a moment of personal reckoning. One of the board members, an older woman named Ellen Simmons, finally spoke. "Mrs. Bennett," she said firmly, "what you've brought forward is not only valid, it's vital. We cannot call ourselves a premium airline if we're failing to serve people with basic fairness." Alexander nodded. "We're not here today to hand out punishments. We're here to start meaningful change." He turned to Caroline, Richard, and Diane. "You three are not being terminated. That would be easy, but it wouldn't solve the problem." The room stirred. The attendants glanced at each other, clearly surprised. Instead, he continued, "You'll be temporarily reassigned. 1 month working directly in our customer advocacy department, reading complaints, speaking with passengers, hearing their stories. The following month, you'll serve in economy class, shoulder to shoulder with travelers who often get overlooked." There was no sarcasm in his tone. No anger. Just firm, unflinching purpose. "If, at the end of that period, your performance shows growth, you'll have the opportunity to return to first class. But only if you've earned it back, through understanding, not assumption." Patricia cleared her throat. "And I will personally oversee the rollout of a new anti-bias training program for all customer-facing employees," she said. "This won't be a one-time lesson. It will be part of how we do business." Olivia gave a small nod. "This isn't about shaming anyone. It's about doing better. Seeing people for who they are, not what they wear." That day, Summit Airlines didn't just address an incident. It began correcting a culture, one that had quietly let discrimination hide behind policy for too long. 3 months had passed since Olivia Bennett stood in that boardroom and shared her story with Summit Airlines leadership. And though corporate change rarely happens overnight, something remarkable had taken root. From check-in counters to in-flight service, the airline began to feel different. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the hum of an engine gaining altitude. Staff across the company had undergone intensive training, not the kind filled with empty corporate slogans, but workshops grounded in real-life scenarios, storytelling, and honest dialogue. Olivia and Alexander had worked closely with the customer advocacy team to design a program that focused on seeing the whole person, not just the ticket, the outfit, or the seat number. The company also revamped its customer feedback system. Now, if passengers experienced moments that felt dismissive or biased, they could report them easily, and those reports would be flagged, tracked, and reviewed at the highest levels. No more brushing it off as just a misunderstanding. Inside the airline, something else changed too: morale. For years, frontline employees had silently wrestled with the pressure to protect the premium experience, a phrase that, over time, had become shorthand for making snap judgments. Now, staff felt encouraged to treat every customer with respect, not just the ones who looked the part. And it wasn't just employees who noticed. Passengers did too. Customer satisfaction scores had climbed significantly over the previous quarter. Compliments about the warmth and professionalism of the crew were rolling in, especially from travelers who had once felt invisible: elderly passengers, young people flying alone, working-class folks with wrinkled jeans and stories on their faces. Other airlines took note. Trade publications wrote about Summit's radical recentering of customer service, and travel blogs praised the airline's leadership for addressing internal bias without resorting to public shaming or empty PR statements. For Alexander and Olivia, that was the greatest victory. Not headlines, not applause, but knowing that ordinary travelers now boarded their flights with a greater chance of being seen, heard, and treated like they belonged, because they did. Even the 3 flight attendants, Caroline, Richard, and Diane, had changed. They had completed their reassignment period, working alongside the customer advocacy team and rotating through economy cabins. And by all accounts, something in them had shifted. They were more thoughtful, more aware, less focused on appearances, more attuned to humanity. No, it hadn't been an easy journey. Humbling work never is. But it was worth it. As Olivia reflected during a quiet evening on the balcony of their Denver penthouse, watching the sun set behind the Rockies, she thought about something her father once told her. Real change doesn't happen when people get punished. It happens when people learn why they need to change, and then choose to. Summit Airlines hadn't just updated its training manuals. It had updated its heart. It was a clear morning in Denver when Olivia Bennett boarded Summit Airlines Flight 923, bound for San Francisco. She wore the same outfit as before, dark gray sweatshirt, matching sweatpants, and her favorite black baseball cap. No makeup. No jewelry beyond the silver bracelet she'd worn for years. Nothing had changed about her appearance. But almost everything else had. She settled into seat 2A in first class and opened a well-worn paperback. The cabin still featured the same wide leather seats, polished wood paneling, and calming lighting. But this time, the atmosphere was different. It felt lighter, less guarded. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennett," a familiar voice said. Olivia looked up to see Richard, the same flight attendant who once doubted she belonged. His posture was respectful, his smile genuine. "Can I offer you something to drink before takeoff?" he asked. "Just water, thank you," Olivia replied with a nod. As he placed the glass gently on her armrest, he paused. "I don't know if you remember me." "I remember," she said, gently but firmly. Richard gave a small nod. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "These past few months, they've changed the way I see people. The way I think about service. That time I spent listening to customers, working in economy, I'll never forget it." Olivia met his eyes. There was no trace of arrogance, no defensiveness. Only humility. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "That's why we did it." Farther down the aisle, she spotted Diane helping an older man with a worn duffel bag find space in the overhead bin. Her tone was kind, her body language patient. Not performative, genuinely present. Caroline, too, moved through the galley with quiet efficiency, pausing to greet each passenger with eye contact and respect. This was not about forced niceties. It was about something deeper, a shift in how people were seen. As the aircraft descended, Olivia glanced out the window at the Colorado landscape slipping into the distance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "How's the flight?" She smiled. "Different. Better." 2 rows ahead, a young woman in ripped jeans and a thrifted denim jacket laughed with her companion, receiving the same attentive service as the suited businessman across the aisle. No raised eyebrows. No subtle dismissals. This, Olivia thought, was the real victory. Not that she could now sit in first class without being questioned, but that so could everyone else, regardless of what they wore, where they came from, or how much they were worth. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Caroline approached with a beverage cart. When she reached Olivia, she paused and spoke quietly. "What you and Mr. Bennett did, it changed us," she said. "And not just how we do our jobs. It changed how we see people." Olivia nodded. That was the point. Not punishment. Progress. And as the jet cruised towards San Francisco, she felt something settle deep inside her, not triumph, not vindication. Just peace. At its core, Olivia Bennett's story isn't just about a mistaken seat assignment, it's about how easily we judge others based on appearances, and how much richer life becomes when we choose not to. Many of us have lived long enough to know that character has nothing to do with clothing, wealth, or status. Yet even in our everyday lives, at the grocery store, in the waiting room, or on a plane, we may find ourselves making quiet assumptions. Who looks like they belong? Who seems out of place? And how often do those quick impressions lead us to miss something far more meaningful? Olivia's quiet dignity reminds us that true strength doesn't need to raise its voice. Real change doesn't always come from shouting, it often begins with listening, with courage, and with treating others as we hope to be treated. Even when she had the power to humiliate those who wronged her, she chose instead to teach them. And in doing so, she didn't just change 3 people, she changed a system. For those of us in the later seasons of life, this story calls us to reflect on the legacy we leave behind. Are we modeling kindness for the next generation? Are we willing to grow, even now, when the world still has lessons to teach us? Perhaps the greatest takeaway is this: every person you meet is carrying something you can't see. And the smallest act of respect can become a turning point, not only for them, but for you. Because dignity isn't just given to the powerful. It belongs to everyone. And seeing each other clearly, that's where the healing begins.